All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We'll give it a second to see if there's any more people joining. I have a poll at the bottom of the screen just to see, if you've ever used GraphQL before, trying to get just a pulse of the room, see where everyone's at, used it before, not used it before, just to see, maybe we can skip around the slides. Maybe there's some more stuff I should focus on inside of this. See some more people trickling in. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Michael Watson. I am a developer advocate at Apollo, specifically for Apollo Federation, but really with just GraphQL server development. That's primarily one of my focuses. Really excited to be here to talk with you a little bit more about GraphQL and how it can start connecting all these different data sources and everything together. For those that just joined, you see a little poll at the bottom. If you can just take a few minutes to click into that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I got some slides that we're going to go through. I got some materials that we'll go through, and everything will be available for everyone to pick up right away. Okay. All right. Now that we got a good amount of people in here, let's get everything started. Actually, before I share my slides, I'm going to be showing some stuff today with some code. We'll be doing some designing stuff. If you wanted to get started and just kind of walk along with everything that I'm doing, there is some stuff I'll be showing as far as code. There's this connected data world in our Apollo Solutions repo. I'm going to drop this in the chat window as well, so it's easier for anyone to grab as a link. But if you want to clone that repo, this is going to be what I'm going to be showing later on after we go through some slides and some other stuff. Now, for those that just joined, my name is Michael Watson, developer advocate for Apollo Federation. Today, we're going to be talking about the graph and really how it's building a strategic advantage for your business with GraphQL. Now, for this class, we're going to have a couple things. We're going to talk about your graph as capabilities. We're going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes inside of that. We'll leave plenty of time for questions. If anyone does have questions as we're going through this, feel free to drop them in the chat window. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on that, answering questions as I go along. Then we're going to talk about schema design. So really, your graph has these capabilities that you're going to be building. And one of the questions I commonly get is like, how do we just design our graph and our schema out? So we're going to go into some real practical discussions there and also look at what are all those things inside of GraphQL, the spec, GraphQL operations, documents, AST nodes, all these random things that you may have never heard before. And it's kind of a big question. And then we'll actually look at like what it looks like to build out our first GraphQL server based on everything inside of here. Now, one of the things to start out inside of this is like, why GraphQL? The whole premise of like why we're here is we want to think about connecting all of our data. And GraphQL is actually one of the things a lot of companies use to connect all of their data together for their front ends, whatever, their website, their mobile app, lots of different scenarios. Maybe they have a backend for front end, but GraphQL is giving them a strategic advantage in a lot of categories. Now, specifically, oh, my monitor just went black. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Went one screen too fast. Okay. So one of the big reasons why GraphQL is really digital is where everything's going. Digital has been the big change over the last 5 years. It leads to faster growth for companies, a lot better return for the overall company together, and just together productivity and excitement in the developers. Developers are able to interact with their data sources in a much friendlier way instead of trying to figure out what APIs I need to interact with to do all this. But it is very important to note that, GraphQL isn't just this magic bullet. Part of it is, the graph that you build helps provide what that velocity and really the change in your product over time. And there's a lot of different teams. We're actually going to go into one example a little bit deeper into Expedia, but all of this is about the digital experience across all of our platforms. When I think about ordering something on my phone and then being able to like pick it up in stores, or even, I recently bought a house and looking at other houses around, just like with Zillow, how do we make sure that this experience of what we're providing is seamless across everything? And that seamless experience is what helps provide the advantage. And that's really what GraphQL has the opportunity for us to do. Now, I want to talk a little bit quickly about Expedia. And I've worked very closely with the Expedia group on their graph and kind of their evolution over time. I first started interacting with them back in 2018. And I think what's really important to understand is how much they actually use the graph to power. When we're thinking of all of these different data sources as we're building our business, our app, maybe you're starting out with, I have one application, I'm just building a website, I need a backend for that website to put this data together. But fast forward to a world like Expedia, where they've acquired multiple businesses. They have multiple different avenues where it's like you can rent a car, I can get hotels, I can get flights. These are all different teams within the organization. And so, the challenge is, how do you bring all this together and create really a seamless experience across all of these platforms? If you think about how a lot of people travel, you're probably booking a lot of these things on your computer or maybe sitting at home. But when you're traveling and you have an issue, you're on your phone, right? How many times have I been at the airport and I'm trying to pull up, my flight on my phone or something, trying to figure out some details of a change. And it gets really frustrating when you're like, I could do this on my laptop, but I can't do it on my phone. And the only reason for that is you just kind of have this BFF strategy, or you have these different teams that are each trying to create a beautiful experience, but they have different ways they're implementing that. And this is where you have product managers that get involved. We want to have a seamless experience. And this is really what GraphQL is starting to bring, and what GraphQL brought specifically to Expedia. Now, their graph powers all of their client applications. They have a pretty impressive portfolio of applications that consume this graph, but that's really delivered by the experiences they can put together and bring together. Now, when you have your schemas being owned by separate teams, there's a lot of details that go into that. And I don't want to overwhelm anyone with like this grand big scheme, because really with GraphQL, you could be starting with one small slice of the pie. You can be starting with the whole pie. It really is going to fit your needs wherever you're at. And so I think it's really important to know that, all of these things, Expedia, I think, is a great example of the fast forward to the future, what you could have with that graph and connecting all the data sources of the business, the app, the thing you're trying to build. And it's going to lead to faster development, right? If you have a website designed in a way with the right capabilities in your graph, well, moving over into a mobile app or a watch or voice or these new, smart TVs, there's all these new platforms, paradigms that are popping up, and you just want to be able to consume that data, right? Now, I have a couple more things in here. I put all of these slides together. I'm going to be leaving everyone with the link to these slides so you can click through them, see them. There's also a case study on Apollo's website. But the important aspect of the graph and the experience, and what I really want to highlight here, is the similarities you have between these, but the differences of what they pull together, right? We have hotels, activities, flights, and cars here. If you kind of think of the data sources of where you're getting that, right? You have tons of hotel partners, Hyatt, Marriott, all these different ones that are showing up in here. And then, you also have that same type of thing for activities. What are activities in those areas? I'm sure there's stuff with local governments like Visit California, things like that are being played into this. Flights, airlines, cars, Hertz, Avis, enterprise, budget. All these are various data sources. And as a client consumer trying to just make the best search experience for a flight, that is really just connecting all those data sources together. And I don't care about all those data sources. I just want the results to be able to provide this rich UI experience. This is actually one of the reasons developers love GraphQL. because they get to focus on building their app. They get to focus on building their thing. They just get the data they need, and they get the experience they need if the graph is designed with the right capabilities. Now, I want to talk quickly about the architecture of specifically Expedia groups, so you can kind of see what that is. In a traditional world where you've kind of grown over time, like Expedia had, you probably started out the website. You had various services that website connected to. Mobile starts up, so that team says the responses for our website aren't fast enough, or there's fetching too much data, whatever that might be. So they create their own backend that brings things together in the way they need it. And this creates a lot of overlap. It also doesn't share the learnings across teams. So one team probably built, an experience as far as, hey, we did this in our graph for these reasons, for these performance reasons, to provide this experience to the user. But the website doesn't have that because it's a whole different backend. So that experience, that great thing of like why they put it in mobile, you probably also want that in the website and these other applications that you're having. And that's what I mean about that capability experience. Now, when Expedia started going down GraphQL, they went into a federated architecture where they had multiple GraphQL servers and GraphQL schemas that are brought together. This allowed each team to kind of own a domain like flights and hotels. They can contribute their portion of those data sources and everything into the common graph. Now, we're going to look at just a single graph and starting there. That's kind of the first steps. But the end state and what we can get to very quickly is being able to connect any of those data sources and be able to have GraphQL microservices that are kind of bringing this all together. Now, our main problem here today is all of our apps are exposed to this full complexity of all these different services. All these services, these databases, these random things you might be needing, you might have ownership of some of them, but you also might not have ownership of a lot of them, right? You might have various APIs. Like the Expedia use case, most of those, most of the data and that information they're showing is from their partner network, which is going to be partner APIs that they're interacting with. So those are services that they don't directly own, but it's so critical for the end user experience of what that is. And this is where a lot of teams have tried to build BFFs. There's some API gateway, MuleSoft, there's various technologies, Kong, all the cloud providers have API gateways, but some way to wrangle all of these services together and make it easier for these client teams to create APIs, pieces of all the data services. I've had multiple teams tell me we have 500, 700 REST APIs that we need to interact with, and just trying to find out what APIs I need to interact with to provide this experience becomes a very large effort. And this is where kind of the tribal knowledge of the business starts to accelerate in certain ways, when really we want to just start putting that tribal knowledge really into the graph and what those capabilities are. Right. And this is really the future of application development. If you think of GraphQL's origins, GraphQL started back with Facebook. So Facebook, 2015, that's when they first released the spec, so GraphQL does have a specification that is associated with it. There's a GraphQL working group around that. And they have multiple revisions, changes to that all the time. So there's a very rich ecosystem that is built around GraphQL. And the adoption of GraphQL has gotten really large. So when you think about applications you visit today, probably half the apps, websites, things you've pulled up on your phone or your desktop probably interact with GraphQL. So a lot of teams have really started to bring this together. And I think importantly, when you're doing it the right way, that's where you're able to really understand the capabilities of your business and what that is providing. All right. Now, before we start jumping into the capabilities, how we should be thinking about designing a graph and start talking about like building a graph, I just want to field the room. Are there any questions anyone might have about kind of like why GraphQL? Maybe there's been a lingering thought of like, hey, we do REST all the time, and I get this question, or someone brought GraphQL up and now we're starting to consider it. Any questions, drop them in the chat. If not, we'll just keep going on. Now, I did notice that out of everyone, it looks like about 75% of the room hasn't used GraphQL before. So we got a lot of great material that we're actually going to be walking into right now as our next steps. So let's talk about some basics in GraphQL. And I think one of the very basic things is a schema. So a graph is defined by a GraphQL schema. What we have on the screen is just a really basic example. If you go to graphql.org, there's a lot of information documentation. Be one of the getting started leave behinds after this. But this is actually directly from that. And a couple things that I want to cover to start talking about. For any GraphQL server that's running, there's essentially going to be a top level root of your schema. That's what we have at the top of the screen. And there's always going to be a query type and a mutation type. Now, everything of GraphQL is actually using all of the semantics of REST. So when you're making a request to a GraphQL server, you're typically doing that as a post. And that post is going to have all this information. There's ways to do GET requests, do CDN caching, lots of stuff like that. Very rich ecosystem around all of that. But at its very basic level, you are using REST essentially for everything inside of here. But what's really interesting about this is we're kind of simplifying things down into what I think of as query, which is really about getting data, fetching that information that you need. And mutation is really about changing something, doing something, right? And a lot of times it's kind of associated with like a put or a patch, some type of change in your backend or that database. But I like to think of it as like what can I do with the capabilities inside? And we're going to get a little more into that. Now, I mentioned root types of your schema, the query type and the mutation type. This is part of GraphQL's type system. And the thing that's really important to note about the type system of GraphQL, and we'll see this in a little bit, when you see these shapes on the screen, like this type query and this hero that has a character, and there's a type character that has a name and it appears in, the shape of the requests that actually ends up getting sent in GraphQL will have a matching result in that same shape, and it's part of that type system. So it's just important to note that there's going to be types inside of our graph that we're defining. And there's going to be things like what are the default built-in scalar types. So we have int, float, string, Boolean, ID. Those are what's built into GraphQL. And then, of course, you can have custom scalars. Very common. Teams will have date, time. You might want to use a scalar for something like validating something. So I mentioned date, time. Sometimes teams have a certain format of how date, time is, and they have a scalar type, they have a scalar date, time that they implement to validate that that's in the right format or whatever rules they might want to have. So important to note that. And then there's, of course, enumeration types. So the enumeration types, this is just like your New Hope, Empire, Jedi, various movies that a character can appear in. Now, it's important to note that enumerations specifically in GraphQL are going to be specific to languages, meaning, in JavaScript, enumerations are handled as integers within GraphQL. Other ones will handle them differently, but to the end client consumer, all that's abstracted away and it ends up just becoming a string as far as the results. Just important to note that, there are some of those specifics, and GraphQL has a rich ecosystem support for languages that we'll kind of talk about in a bit, but there are specifics in each one of those languages. Each language likes to have their own nice to haves, their own additions, but the GraphQL spec is the base of what you'd want to kind of look at. This is that schema basics that we have right here. Now, there's one thing that I didn't put on the screen and I didn't bring into here. I don't want to go into too many details, but there is one other aspect that's pretty important within GraphQL that is directives. A directive is essentially metadata markup that you can have inside of a query, a GraphQL schema that does some additional thing for you. It's very common, for example, authorization, to have an authorization directive that says, you need to be an admin to use this field, this type inside of my graph. Now, that's, I think, a little bit more of an advanced topic that definitely is in materials out there. But for getting started, teams typically don't need to deal with custom directives until they're kind of at that next step. All right, so let's actually talk a little bit about our platform that we're building, right? So we kind of talked about there's like the schema that's going to be defined. It's got these like root query types, there's other things in it. This is what we're essentially handcrafting of what is that capability, that exposure we want to provide to people. Like, do you want to allow people to just search for heroes? Is that like a functionality that you want to have in here? So when you start thinking about, all right, I'm going to build a graph, or I'm going to build an app, what is the capability? What is that experience that you're actually providing and really driving to the end user? And is that actually what you want, right? Sometimes you kind of get into this workflow of like, all right, we built the thing for the website, now we build the thing for mobile, and that web thing doesn't quite work how we want it for the mobile thing for whatever reasons. This is a lot of times when you get into the, well, specific to your app. But the differences there are really capturing the differences in capabilities, right? Your phone might not have the screen real estate to do certain things. It might not have certain capabilities, or your phone might have things available in the iOS and Android SDKs that aren't available in your JavaScript land for your website. There's a lot of differences between those, but these are really the platform specific, client side specific things that are going to be using the data from the graph to provide the specific thing for that end client. So you still want to have those capabilities across your platform being used uniformly. And so what I like to think about is entities and capabilities. And so I have an example on the screen where there's a query, and we can imagine maybe we're looking at our active cart, right? So I clicked on view my cart, and I'm just looking at that cart. So that web screen that's displaying me is viewing, my cart. That's essentially the capability that is inside of there. But there's entities that are behind that, right? We have our user in this example. So that's probably, somewhere in one of our data sources. It could be our CRM provides our users. Could be we have an external database that is hooked up to an API, whatever it may be, that's our users. But those users are then connected with these other data sources. There's a profile around the user, right? Their name, their email, whatever the information is. And then there's probably a different service there, or a different database that's storing what are the items in people's carts. Maybe I have multiple carts I can have. Maybe I have only an active cart. This is where you start thinking about what are the capabilities of I'm trying to provide. I want to create an experience where someone can get in their cart. They probably need to be able to do things like remove an item from a cart. Probably need to be able to update the quantity of an item in a cart. You can start thinking of what are the capabilities around this entity that I want to design and start bringing together. Now, what's really important when you're thinking about designing your graph and you're thinking about these entities capabilities, you probably don't have this shape on the left side of the screen. This is actually what is called a GraphQL operation. And this is what a client consumer of your graph would be writing to get information from that graph. So I mentioned that the shape of the operation is the shape of the response. We'll expect a JSON object that will have the exact same shape as this response. Now, some of those things like the items in the active cart is returning an array, but each one of the items in that array is going to have a quantity, a product with a name and a price. So it's a very expected format. And the nice thing about this is client tooling can now start generating types and various things of their workflow based off of this GraphQL operation and what they're trying to put together. But you're probably at a point right now, especially since 75% of the respondents said they haven't used GraphQL before. If you're going into thinking about GraphQL, this is a great moment to take a pause and think, what are the capabilities I just want to put on my graph? And what are the entities and things associated with that are going to have to be on my graph for this to exist? And so now we can start thinking about basically a punch list. Like these are the capabilities. These are the things that we want to create. And we kind of have to think about where to start, right? We may have a list of all these capabilities. We have a list of everything popping up. And where are you going to start with what you're going to put on the screen? This is where you're going to be building your first website, or if you're migrating from something, you're going to be having some existing assets and you're going to be thinking, all right, now how am I going to go bring this into this new world? Well, if you are building a new application, you kind of get to pick where you start. You just pick the thing that you want to start out with, and you're going to be building your graph out from there. But if you already have existing things and you're trying to think like, well, what's even the first thing I should start with? You want to just start with one aspect. I'm showing an active cart because most companies, most applications, most things, they have a cart and they have some experience around that. And the nice thing about that is it's a real life world use case, right? It's got revenue driving impact behind it. If you're successful with this, it's going to show a clear strategy of how you can, now start adopting everything else. So you want to start small. You want to pick out the one piece of functionality of what you're going to start. What is that capability that we're going to be putting into a graph? And then you'll probably start doing something like loading 10% of your traffic for this new graph experience to test it out and start, going down a rollout strategy. But really important to think about what's that first thing I'm going to start with, and let's make sure that it has enough of an impact that the strategy, is really painted going forward. What you don't want to do is you don't want to pick something that is so basic or simple that it doesn't get the buy-in from others of like, yeah, that's a good idea. We should keep going with this strategy. I have another talk that I recently did at GraphQL Summit about migrating from REST to GraphQL. I think it's a great follow-up to this class and session if you wanted to learn a little bit more of kind of the mindset of thinking around that. It's very common for teams coming from that REST world into GraphQL to think like, where do I start? And instead of trying to just build out your whole graph, start with that first capability, pick out that right capability based off internal feedback of, what are those naysays of GraphQL or that graph, and use that. Oops. All right. So we talked a little bit about kind of the capabilities and entities. And we're going to actually switch over in a little bit to VS Code and actually start looking at designing a schema and some of these capabilities and entities. But when we're thinking about like that strategic advantage we're getting, one, we're no longer limited when like a new thing comes out that it's going to be difficult to take what our experiences are and put that into there. So we're going to be able to have faster development time to get those experiences into new things that come out. One example I always love to bring up, it was back in April, it was announced from Amazon, but if you think about Amazon recently, well, not recently, but they acquired Whole Foods. And a big thing was about, how's Whole Foods going to integrate this into, or how's Amazon going to integrate Whole Foods into their whole ecosystem? Initially just started out with like, I can order, I can put my Prime account in, I can order groceries through Whole Foods and kind of start going down the experience. But what it really starts to become about is how can you take these new data sources, these new capabilities, the capability of a grocery store and all these different items, and bring that with your other experiences together in a faster way. Well, Amazon also has a lot of things around biometric devices, a watch, a thing. And they're actually now going to be integrating to where you can have your biometric devices actually based off your workouts, everything, match with your calorie intakes and give you recommendations on food, recipes, different things that can be automatically ordered through Whole Foods with just a couple clicks, right? And that's the reality of the competition of what we're working with here. And it's really important that when these new things start coming out, we saw this with wearables, we're seeing it with voice, we're going to see it with more things in the future. We want to be prepared for that. And so when we have our graph with all of those capabilities, we are prepared for that. Now, our graph's going to need to mutate and change and morph over time, but that base set of capabilities will almost always be needed for all of these platforms. If we take that cart example, well, I can talk to my Amazon Alexa and see what's in my active shopping cart. I can go online, look at that. I can do it on my phone. There's a lot of different ways I can actually get that information. And that's all part of that experience of what I'm talking about. Now, the thing that I love about this as a developer that focuses a lot on the back end stuff, the big strategic advantage you're getting there is all these teams now can work independently. A team that really cares about, hey, we built our microservices in Scala for reasons A, B, C, D. Great. It's just a data source inside of a graph. It's like every reason you did that, that's fantastic. There's a very large ecosystem support around those various languages. So that's something I kind of encourage. You have these backend teams now that can build whatever they want in their languages, and you actually can swap them out as needed. Now, why would you maybe need to do that? If you think about things like your CRM, your customer relationship management software, maybe you started out in a world where you had, some free simple thing, and then you're moving into Salesforce. Well, all of those APIs, all of those things that were set up, there's gonna be similarities, but a lot of it will be different. And the nice thing about a graph is if you expose them the right way, well, those capabilities didn't change. It's just the data source that really changed. So now the team that owns, that portion of the graph that is around our CRM can now swap out that data source without having any impact to the client developer teams. This is a really, really powerful advantage that now your backend teams are completely independent of your front end teams as far as the work they're doing together. And it almost becomes that the schema is really now the contract between the front end teams and the backend teams. Now, if you're just building an app and you're working, by yourself or in a small team, that's not as big of a deal, right? Teams that are full stack development, I've seen plenty of teams kind of go in that direction where they work on both ends. The nice thing about that is that actually is a very fast way to share the learnings and be able to move back and forth between them, right? Hey, this new thing came out. We want to plug it into our graph. All right, I can go put that in, and now I'm going to work on what that client experience is. So you kind of have the option of, you could have a full stack development around this and everything, but you're also set up for the future where now as your project grows, you're easily set up to, get into that world. One question I get a lot of times is, I'm just building a simple app. I could build a BFF for it and I just make a REST API and everything's great. But what happens if that project is successful and you want to move into, a mobile app or something like that? Now you're kind of in this situation where you kick the can down the street. Now you got to pick that can up and, take that next step. Where with a graph with capabilities, you have a lot of that work actually already built in this graph and it can start being used. Now, I saw a question just pop up. I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Tane. With schema, how does GQL play with things like Open API in providing documentation and contracts? So that is a great question. So one of the things that a lot of teams will do is trying to plug in their Open API world into their graph. This is where there's been a lot of efforts as far as like auto generation from a Swagger definition, an Open API definition into a GraphQL schema, and then using something like that. Very common in proof of concept, teams trying to show value inside of GraphQL very quickly. But one of the challenges that does is it actually makes a resty feeling graph. So a lot of times you still want to generate some of your graph from your Open API definition or whatever you might have. And it's kind of like the types in the sense of like, if I have an API that has contacts, for example, and with the URL, I give the contact ID and I get a giant JSON response of those contacts. That might be something we want to directly plug in, but do we want to copy all the fields of those contacts over? Probably not. If you have things like, let's say the contacts have an active cart. That active cart is actually active cart ID as a field on the contact from that Open API. Well, you don't want to expose that ID inside of your graph. one of the things I always talk about whenever you're exposing that ID in your graph, you really just want to be referencing that type, that thing directly. And your graph should just figure it out for you, in the sense that I wouldn't be referencing on a contact the active card ID. I would just be referencing the active card, and that abstracts that away from my client developers. Because every time I give them that ID back, really, they're going to use that probably for some other data fetch, some other information they need to grab. And a lot of times when they're doing this chaining of events, sometimes that's a sign of missing functionality in your graph and something you might want to bring together. A great example is I have to do one mutation. I take the result from that mutation to do another mutation to change something. Authorizing a credit card and then charging it, for example. Well, if you're doing that all in one motion, though, you probably want to add an additional capability that brings those together and abstracts that away from the client developer. Now, this is kind of like, how am I going to take my open API, my thing, and start plugging it into the graph? But let's also quickly talk about the documentation contracts. I don't want to gloss over that. I think that's a really important aspect. One of the big things about GraphQL is it's just natural documentation. And let's break out of the slides for a second, actually just go. So one of our products we have is Apollo Studio. Really not trying to talk about our product and everything, but we use a graph behind the scenes and everything here. Ooh, I need to update my Chrome. That's definitely not a good thing to be giving a class and I have my Chrome like this. Now, one of the I'm big on going into people's websites, different things. So one of the things I always just like to show is like how you could even see like our websites using GraphQL. Sometimes in exploring things, you might just want to like learn like, is this website using GraphQL? Is this going on? Like what is out there? One of the ways I go through is I'll actually just open up Chrome DevTools and type in GraphQL for whatever the website I'm looking at is. This is usually the API URL you can get. So the reason I'm showing this is actually our GraphQL API right here. Now, Apollo Server 3 ships with this thing inside of here. That's Apollo Sandbox. I was like trying to say the word Apollo Sandbox, what it's called. And this is actually the experience of being able to start querying your graph and everything. There is also things like GraphQL Playground, graphical. Let me show you actually as a example, V4 API. Oh, I should have V4 API. GitHub has a GraphQL API. It's the version 4 of their API. Version 3 is their REST API. There's a lot of things inside of here, but inside of here they have what's called Explore. It's graphical is the project. It's an open source library. But this is the documentation that actually comes along with this. So with GraphQL, that graph schema that you end up creating is actually partially really what the documentation is for using that graph and understanding it. I'm just going to sign in with my GitHub real quick. But in here, I have a query inside of here. Should have there. Okay, there we go. So I have queries, I have mutations. I can click into it. I can see code of conduct. So the schema itself is a natural documentation. One of the benefits a lot of people think with GraphQL. Now, one thing I'll say is graphical. This project was like one of the very first tools that like documents and allows developers to explore into like what is in that graph. There are other things out there. There's also GraphQL Playground. This was actually something Apollo, we shipped in Apollo Server 2. This gives a kind of like a newer, nicer UI. It has a schema, similar documentation, similar usage inside of that. And then there's what I mentioned, which was Apollo Sandbox, which there's a couple ways this actually can be thought about. And I'll actually show you one of my applications that's actually connected up to AWS. This is like the Apollo side of things with documentation. We actually self-document that schema in a kind of a different way, where you can now have more of a click type of experience of what is the query I'm trying to build, and being able to execute that here to get that information from your graph. Now, this is kind of everything about what I'm showing you here is all free. I'm not trying to, show you the Apollo platform and everything in today's talk, but I do want to make you know this is another one of the tools that's out there and available. So for example, all of my customers, all of the Apollo customers that work with the platform, one of the things they get out of having their schemas put into Apollo's platform is this documentation with inside of Apollo Sandbox, which is like if you're running it locally, or Apollo Explorer, which is if you're running it in the cloud. And then the last thing you mentioned about contracts. Specifically, I'm thinking contracts of like me as a developer, I can do this, changing my persona. I'm like a salesperson, not an engineer. And now the contract I have available within my open API is different. This is actually what a lot of teams will do with directives. So I mentioned that authorization directive. We actually have a feature called contracts in Apollo, but the basic concept of what everyone does here is they have directives that give some sort of metadata information. The most common simplistic example is @internal, meaning this field, this functionality, this capability is only available to internal employees. And so what they'll do is they'll actually host two versions of their graph, the internal version and the public facing version. Maybe you have to be on VPN for your internal version, but what really happens is when that server is starting up, this schema is being visited, and anything with those internal directives is being removed before the server starts up. So that way someone can't, use that internal functionality. I've seen teams take that very far as granularity. I'm more giving you the example of the simplest use case, because typically, when you're building your graph, you will have at a basic level a private graph that has all of your customer support functionality, all of the things you need to do to like help your customers, help your product thing. And then you have the public graph, which is like what powers your applications. And that's typically a subset of that private graph. And so I like to think of that as that's your contract, in the sense I'm going to take that private graph, I'm going to make the subset for what that public graph is. So that's very common of what the path for contracts is. And everything I showed with this documentation stuff works for both those graphs now, right? And this is where if you have them hosted as separate URLs, it's very easy of, okay, I went to the internal thing. Here's all the internal functionality that's inside of there, along with that public functionality, and being able to explore it just like we showed in here, graphical or GraphQL Playground. Tane, before I move on, any other questions kind of on the Open API documentation contract side? Cool. Awesome. And yeah, that's definitely some of the risks in falling back for sure. All right. Now, I'm going to keep track of time. We're going to go, actually, we got to take breaks inside of here. Why don't I do this? We can go, where am I on my slides? Let's actually go through a couple more things and we'll take a quick break inside of here. Just a 5-minute one, but let's actually talk a little bit about some of those document items. So in some of the previous slides, we showed this schema, right? And all of this information in here. I mentioned that there's the GraphQL spec. And I should actually show this for my colleague, Ivan. He would love it. Not many people have read the spec. I think it's really important to note that there is a spec out there. And there's a lot of work that goes into this within the community. And we won't be able to cover all this inside of here, but there's a very rich ecosystem inside of here. And I wanted to pull this up because I thought the documentation conversation actually has something important in here. So introspection. Introspection is actually part of the spec. This is actually what gives that documentation thing. So for example, GraphQL Playground, the way it works when it starts up, it runs an introspection request to your GraphQL server. And that response is how it's creating its documentation. Like, here's all the types, here's all the things that we need. So it's really important to note that that introspection API, that's part of the GraphQL spec, is one of the things a lot of teams build tooling off of. Now, introspection is powerful and there's a lot of great things there, but you also need to understand and really want to make sure that when you're thinking about resiliency in your graph, that you don't want to have your deployment infrastructure, other things like that, relying on introspection for changes, updates, things like that. You want to start having more of static assets in the sense of like, here's what my schema is. My schema is going to be changing from this to that. If that is something that's driving my deployment or something around that, having introspection be the root of it is just a point of failure. It's more of my point. Whereas something like, if I had a CI pipeline, now we have a registry with Apollo that is all about storing your schema inside of there. But if you just think about it on a simple level, storing that GraphQL schema in like a cloud storage file versus sending an introspection request out to a server, not only going to cut down your CI build times, but it's also just going to be more resilient, more expected. And it's pretty easy to, for example, take a flat file and get it pushed into that, or run your server locally in CI, introspect it locally in CI, and then have that asset be pushed somewhere, right? And that could be like a GitHub action that you just have inside of your repo that just automatically takes care of that for you, keeps the repo's, schema in sync with this in cloud storage, right? Still uses a lot of the things around introspection, but the resiliency factor is now, okay, now let's have all our tooling, all of our people point at this file that is, got 99.9999, with our cloud provider, all of that type of stuff with uptime and all of that. But very powerful. There's also a whole validation system in here. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that. I think one of the important things inside of all of the validation, it talks about the document, that GraphQL document we were talking about, but really what it is there's a whole mechanism, a visitor API, that allows you to visit a GraphQL document. I mentioned the directive for contracts and how they'll use like that at internal. Well, you use the visitor API to visit that GraphQL schema or portions inside of it and remove those portions to give you your contract version of that schema, for example. So if you're really interested in GraphQL and you want to read through this, I highly recommend it. It's pretty long, but I think it's a great read. It's really more if you're into reading the spec or not. Cool. So the schema has a bunch of different things that get referred to. I remember when I first started in GraphQL, one of the things I got confused was like, there's a document node, there's an AST node, there's like this schema that I need, and all these words just started getting thrown around, and it was really hard for me to kind of like wrap my head around it. And that's one thing that I kind of want to quickly talk through, and I actually want to go into maybe VS Code and we'll show some things. But one of the first things I think about is just the top level. What is a GraphQL document? This gets really interchangeably used between GraphQL operations and a GraphQL schema, because they both are GraphQL documents. They both are a valid GraphQL document. And this is one of the things that makes it really easy for a client developer in GraphQL to be able to contribute into a server side of GraphQL. And it's partially just because that query you're writing is the shape of the graph and the shape of that schema and the response that you're getting. But I want to put the official definition up in here, because what's really important to know is we're essentially having various tokens that have pointers inside of this document. That visitor method of what I was mentioning, we're able to visit these tokens, these positions, to know like this type, this field is returning this type. So you could, for example, visit a document that has a type info attached to it. There's various things you can do inside of there. Now, from that GraphQL document, GraphQL, and I'm showing the JavaScript side of things. This is from the documentation and the spec. Any server language that is spec compliant will have this parse function. But what's important to know is it can take a string, which could be that GraphQL operation, that query we saw, or a string as that schema, and it's going to return that document, right? So that GraphQL document is parsed from a string, right? And this is where there's a lot of power inside of the predictability of what's going to happen and how you can use these things like the visitor APIs, the introspection APIs to do a lot of very interesting things, in your CI pipelines, your development workflows, your tooling, like really make your developer experience amazing. I mean, I've seen some pretty impressive things done with, a simple visitor method or even some linting rules that were created very specific to like that use case. So there's a lot of power here of what you can do. Now, I had mentioned like that schema and everything. Here's just like an example of that active cart query we were showing. This is the schema side that would be on the server. And this would be the document of what we're providing to our server. So, we might just be writing this out, and we're actually going to do that in just a couple minutes. We'll write out some schema, and that would be the string of what's passed into this parse function, which creates the document of what we then provide to our GraphQL server. So I talked about that language support. So this is straight from graphql.org, but you can see the rich ecosystem there is around just GraphQL. Most of these languages also have GraphQL servers. There's open source libraries out there, in the JavaScript, TypeScript land. Of course, we have Apollo server. There is, other server implementations outside of just Apollo in the JavaScript land. There's also a lot of server implementations across all of these languages. One of the things I think is really important to note is the spec was released in JavaScript land. When changes happen to the spec, all the other languages have to migrate, right? There's a time frame where they don't become spec compliant, and they have to. Now, even in Apollo server, there's things that could break from version 15 to 16. We're currently on 15 something. But when 16 comes out, there's probably gonna be some changes inside of that specification. So each one of these languages has their own adoption cycle. Some are more popular in the community than others. I'm not here to point you at any specific one. I think it's important that you just research. What is that ecosystem around there? I'll be honest, I've never heard of anyone doing Elm GraphQL stuff. Doesn't mean you can't do it. Doesn't mean there's like not a lot there, but just not as common of one. I don't want to pick on Elm. I just looked at the screen and picked one. I could say that for a couple more of these for sure. But it is important to understand what your support level across that ecosystem is, because these are all open source packages, every single one of these. And there's going to be an adoption cycle in everything. If you've done mobile development in the past, you're very familiar with that type of world with iOS and Android, and being able to support that, a couple days later. I used to work at a company called Xamarin, all about .NET mobile development. And they actually would have a support for all of the iOS SDKs. Every time iOS released, there was like a 2-week window where, our engineers were working really hard to support it, release it for our customers. But that's the example here, right? There's going to be maybe that hot new feature thing that pops up in GraphQL, and you're using this type of GraphQL server where they haven't implemented that yet. And that's where it's just important to really understand that ecosystem of what you're getting into. Now, at the same time, I'll also say, just going through this list, JavaScript, Go, PHP, Java, Kotlin, .NET, Python, Rust, Ruby, Scala. Those are the top ones of GraphQL servers that I've directly interacted with large companies running those with great success. So I also don't want to scare you off from picking a different language. Use the language that's right for you. And I think the great thing here is you have so much flexibility, and there are so many options here, right? So maybe you have a team that's like, hey, React's great for our front end, and like I get why we want to do GraphQL, but that's not going to work for our backend developers. They're all doing Java. No problem. That graph that I was actually showing you, that's Apollo's graph. We have Apollo server running as part of it, but we also have Kotlin servers. So we do a lot of Kotlin GraphQL on our end. And there's a lot of teams that actually mix them together. One of the beauties of GraphQL is, the teams can use what they want. GraphQL schemas can be brought together. There's a lot of technologies out there that are doing that. I'm a little biased because I'm with Apollo. I'm the Apollo Federation developer advocate. So that would be the one I would say use, but there's a lot of options out there. And I think just knowing that you can bring those together and use different ones is really what's important here. All right. So does anyone have any questions specifically about just the language, what servers are available? I definitely have gotten questions about that in the past. Before we kind of jump out of slides and get into VS Code land and code stuff. All right, cool. And Tane, I just saw what you said. If no one's doing breaks, cool. If anyone wants a break, drop it in the chat. We'll take a break. I don't need to take a break. I was just told, hey, there's going to be breaks if you want to take breaks. Cool. So let me pull over VS Code onto this screen. We're going to actually design a schema. Now, one of the things to talk about, I'd mentioned the code that if you wanted to clone that repo, I've dropped it in the chat. I don't know if this chat window is one of those ones where it doesn't persist. So I'll drop it there again. So if you want to clone this, you can. That's what I'm going to be pulling up in VS Code, and we'll be walking through some stuff. Now, what I'm going to be using in VS Code is a tool called Apollo Workbench. This is actually an extension I created right here. And I'm more using this as a medium to talk about schema design stuff in there. So if you wanted to follow along to the T, you need to put in VS Code and install this extension. Get this little icon that pops up. And that's what we're going to use to talk about designing a schema and putting things together in a graph. Now, if you clone that repo, I have inside of here, you should see this one graph pop up. What I did is I took that GitHub API and I put it in here so we can have just a conversation about that. Now, this tool is designed around Apollo Federation and creating various GraphQL servers that are brought together inside of here. We're just going to be looking at just the single schema for just purposes of discussion. Now, this is GitHub schema. Now, I mentioned the GraphQL microservices and everything because one common theme I've seen with GraphQL is as you start building out your graph, as you start going down the road, your schema gets giant. I mean, this is GitHub schema. This isn't the latest either. I'm sure they've made changes and stuff, but I'm scrolling. We're at 16, 20,000, 26,000 lines. That's a lot. That's a lot of stuff inside of there. And having, for example, like a new employee come in, being able to understand and contextualize in this is very difficult. So one of the things I do find that happens is over time, as that schema gets large, there becomes an effort to break that schema apart. Whether you do GraphQL microservices, whether you have a mono repo and you do some co-location strategy of schema snippets with resolvers, things that all get brought together into one cohesive picture so it's easy to navigate between them. There's lots of options of what people do. But I do see that these schemas want to get broken down at some point. Now, some tips that I use to navigate large schemas like this. I always try and start at the root, right? So I mentioned there is that root type, right? We talked about how there was that schema. Now, one of the things I wanted to do with this of showing, hey, there is no schema inside of here. And what I'm specifically talking about, sorry, I have two screens. I'm not that used to doing two screens. So inside of that initial schema, we were showing, we had this query and mutation in the schema. This is unnecessary to write. If you have a type query and a type mutation, GraphQL will automatically parse that into the document. If you want to name it like flights query, hotels query, and you want to do some strategy where you had multiple naming, there's this concept of aliasing. So you can actually like alias a field to a specific name, different things like that. But you actually don't have to put that top schema. So one of the common ways I first start out at looking at a large schema is looking for that initial type query. Right now, remember that documentation we pulled up in GraphQL. You can see here's code of conduct. You'll also notice these little quotations. These are actually how you can add comments and information into your documentation in GraphQL. It's actually a best practice to do this. You're going to see GitHub's doing a great job of it, obviously. But if we went back in here, notice that's code of conduct. Look up code of conduct by its key. Look up code of conduct by its key, right? So that natural documentation, those comments are coming along in that introspection API. And that's what's being displayed to the users inside of here. So you can add in comments on any type. So I have it written above the type, or on any individual field within that type. And you can even see that this is an argument inside of here. And I can also add documentation into the argument so that I can start to understand. If I clicked on this, you can see the arguments, the code of conduct's key. So really cool that you very quickly start to get that information inside of here. And this is how the documentation could be enhanced inside of your graph. Now, I mentioned about those entities, those capabilities, and what's one thing to quickly note inside of here, and I think for GitHub Enterprise is a good example of what to look at. You know, we're able to look up an enterprise by, they call it a URL slug, but it's like their URL for the enterprise within GitHub. That's kind of like the thing I can do as a consumer at the root level. Now, what are all the things that I can do inside of my graph? Well, there's going to be an enterprise type, right? It implements an interface. So GraphQL types can implement interfaces. So there's an interface in GraphQL that you can have that is something that you implement across a bunch of things. Now, with GraphQL's ecosystem changing over the years, there have been things like the relay specification, which is on top of GraphQL, which has this node interface. There's a whole strategy around it. But I do think it's important to note the relay spec around the node interface, because this is actually a common pattern that a lot of teams use. Also, a lot of teams I've seen use this with Apollo Federation. So a lot of times these various specifications kind of on top of GraphQL, some of them get used together. Important to note that this is available in the ecosystem. Very rich ecosystem inside of GraphQL is kind of what I want to emphasize here. Now, notice all these things in here, right? We have billing information. There's a database ID. I don't necessarily like that, but there's probably a reason GitHub has that inside of there. There's members, right? So one of the functionalities that I can do inside of their graph, right, is I can not only query my enterprise, but I can query the members of my enterprise. And this is where you can start thinking, okay, well, this is the query side of things. What about that mutation side of things? There's a lot of things inside of it. These are the functionality of things I can do, the capabilities within inside of GitHub. Now, I'm a little partial to how graphs can be designed. One of the things I like to point out when you're building your graph, what you see on the screen here, this is what GitHub did for their GraphQL schema, what they thought made sense for them, and how they wanted to do it. And I think it's really important to note that, you know, when you're starting to auto-generate your entire schema, the more you auto-generate, the more of that power you lose. On a flip side, I like to show, let's go back to, one of our graphs in here, and let's just quickly reset back to the root. Oh, this isn't a good one. Let me show you actually this graph. So we're in an e-commerce graph, and inside the query, we have a couple of things here. One of the things I like to do is I like to write my graph in a way that is very natural in the sense of, as I'm writing my GraphQL query, my operation, that data I'm trying to get, it should just make sense to me. In the sense of like, all right, I'm going to make a query to this graph. Okay. What can I do as me? What are the things me has? This is where it starts to become the capabilities for that entity. I'm an entity as a user. What are those things I can get as information inside of there? It's also the mutation side of that. What are the things I can do with that? Right? You don't want to have it just kind of sit in this CRUD world. You know, like I'm going to create this, I'm going to delete this, I'm going to update this. A great example is like updating profile. Yeah, you probably need to be able to update your profile, but there's probably granularity into how that profile updates. You don't want to just have like a type that is being updated, and every time you add a new field, that just becomes part of that mutation. Because now that mutation loses a lot of its meaning, right? Am I updating the profile? Am I updating the shipping address? Am I updating the billing address? It's a zero cost to add fields into your graph, and it helps give granularity and helps the documentation of your graph, because now it becomes easier for someone to understand and play in there. Now, there's a lot of options in here, and I'm going to show you, I think we actually have GitHub inside of here just to show a little contrast, but I think this will actually be easier for us to look at, you know, these root types. For example, a mutation. There's a lot of stuff inside of here, right? But you can understand that, you know, you do see things like some deletes, some creates, right? So there is kind of like that CRUD understanding, but then there's like convert project card note to issue, right? And there's a lot more granularity in here. Remove, that's not delete, but it's kind of similar to delete, but it's something specific inside of their platform, their product, right? And it becomes much easier for me now to start understanding, you know, what's inside of here. And you can see in these updates, right? There's update environment, update enterprise profile, but there's also update organization project settings, repository project settings, right? They didn't lump all that together into the enterprise profile. The granularity there now is the experience of what they want to provide. Like, what do we want to allow our enterprise customers to do with our product, our platform? That is our API, right? And we typically think about that in like the REST world we come from. What are those changes inside of the REST APIs, different things that we might want to be doing? And that's like this contract of like what we're creating. Beautiful thing about GraphQL is we can swap that contract in and out. The schema is really now the representation of your platform you're developing, what you're building. Now, one last thing I want to just quickly talk about. VS Code. We'll pull up VS Code real quick. You know, within all of this, there's definitely a lot of ways of how you can design your graph. And GitHub's graph is one way. Another graph I always recommend checking out, Shopify is another good one to look at. Braintree has great public documentation about their graph out there. There's a lot of public API graphs, documentation, things that you can look at. And I think what's important is as you start developing your graph, one, you just want to get the first stab of your graph out there. It's really important, just like get your graph out there, because you can iterate on it very fastly. And you can make changes, you can add to the schema, you can delete the schema. It is supposed to be a morphing kind of piece. I always think if you have your V1 and then you have your V next, it just keeps evolving, keeps growing, keeps changing, keeps continuing. So with your graph ever evolving, part of it is now you're going to be designing your schema. Maybe you're doing the first part of your schema, but maybe you're also designing out a change to your graph, your schema. So Workbench, this tool that I built, was really all around that concept right there. I want to like plan out a schema. I want to design schema changes, but I don't want to think about code. I don't want to think about anything. I just want to think about the graph that I'm trying to create, and I want to reason with that. All right. So we're actually going to start creating some little designs and start talking about like what we might want to be thinking about when we're putting our graph together. So let's take that active cart use case, right? So let's start thinking about the functionality around a cart that we want to create. So we're just going to call this our first graph. I also shouldn't gloss over these details, but to create a design in Workbench, just this little plus icon, that's what I clicked to type in the name. And this already has everything around GraphQL microservices. We're just going to start out with one. And we're just going to start out with our cart. So we're going to have some service that is going to expose our cart. Now, when you click on the cart, this is opening up the schema. So you can see it's a .graphql file. Now, I get things kind of highlighted and everything in here. If you're following along and you're like, oh, it's not highlighting for me, it kind of look a little different, you probably just don't have a GraphQL edit or a GraphQL extension installed. Like for example, whatever language you work in VS Code, you probably have an extension installed that adds support for that language file. You can use Apollo GraphQL. There is also just the standard GraphQL package. This is the one from the community. That one works as well. That gives you kind of like the highlighting for GraphQL documents. Now, there's a couple things that we talked about. We talked about building those types and everything in there. We talked about that root, right? So having that root type query. Now from our cart services, this is where I talked a little earlier about in the contracts of having that at internal versus not at internal. And when we're thinking about the capabilities we'd be building around our cart is our entity. We have a cart that is uniquely identified by something, but we also have the capabilities that are associated with that cart, right? And so the capabilities of the cart is whatever we want, but there's going to be a different persona, whether it's an internal employee or not, right? Maybe someone's calling in, hey, something's going on. I can't check out. I'm trying to buy this thing. And they're going to pull up your account. Well, they're going to need to see your active cart. So maybe they need to be able to query a cart by the ID of a cart. And so what we have is we're creating an entry point for someone to be able to search our graph for any cart based on this cart's ID. Now, things like authorization. So for example, that bearer token that gets passed, that's probably going to be used exactly the same. So in your first iteration, you're just going to pass that to the downstream service. So it's totally fine with whatever auth patterns, whatever auth strategy you currently have today. You're actually just going to pass that downstream. Now, you may say, I don't want this information to be available if they don't have that authorization. That's that internal directive I kind of talked about. Maybe at the end, if we have some time, I'll pull up a couple of links and we can look at those as a follow-up. But that would be kind of the next level. We also need to define our cart type. And what are the things inside of our cart? So our cart definitely has an ID. Kind of see that just from inside of here. There's a lot of other things. We talked about how there could be items in there. Now, the items in your cart can be defined various ways, right? Maybe you're defining it as product. By enclosing them in these square brackets, that means it's an array, right? So we're returning an array of product items from here. Now, if you're following along, you're seeing these squiggles popping up. One of the things Workbench does, it actually tells you, if you have something missing from your schema or anything like that, it's going to give you context of that. So we can see that, there isn't a product inside of here. This is also inside of the problems panel in VS Code. So this is giving you the information of hey, you're missing this type of stuff. So we can fix that by adding our product. Now, our product might have a thing like a name, probably got a thing like a price, got a float, all of that type of stuff. Now, we've kind of just developed this very, very basic schema. This is just like what we were having inside of there. But one of the really powerful things I'm always surprised when I show this, that a lot of people haven't seen this before in GraphQL, but it's the concept of designing your mutations in a way that really contextualizes what can I do within that thing. Right? So we have a mutation type, And we have a lot of different things we can do. But what I like to do is I like to have a cart mutation. Ooh, I should make that one word. And that cart mutation has all those different things that I can do, like remove item. Right? So I can remove an item from my cart. And this is what I was mentioning of like, what are all those capabilities I can do with that entity, right? I have a cart. What are all the things I can do with a cart? I can remove an item. I can add item. You can also do things like having defaults. So maybe I have a quantity that's also provided. It's an integer and it always defaults to 1. So now I'm starting to kind of make things easy, like, oh, maybe I'm adding multiple items of that or multiple quantity of that. Maybe I just said add items. Maybe you want to add a batch. Right? So now maybe I have a batch of items that I'm adding into a cart. You know, this is now only adding 1. So maybe I want to add some comments. Only adds 1 quantity for every item to cart. Oops, doing there. Now I've added some documentation inside of there, right? So maybe that's like what that default is. And this can start being built out more and more. You know, it could just be like clear cart, clear. We've kind of added some quick mutation type stuff in here. And what I really like about this pattern, so this is a pattern we have at Apollo that we use. I like to think of it as like a nested mutation. But essentially what we're doing here is we're grouping all of that functionality into one type that can be returned by that mutation. Now, Workbench also has this little operations tab where you can actually write an operation. We're just going to look at something. I couldn't think of a clever name right off the top of my head. But this allows us to kind of explore the things that we were just writing, right? So we saw we had written a cart. You know, there's things in there like the items, the name, the price. It's telling me I didn't give it an argument. Right? This is the query that we essentially could be, or we could be writing against this graph. Now, if we look at this on the flip side, and look at a mutation, this is what I think is really powerful. Because now, as a developer trying to understand what I can do in your platform, if I'm doing a mutation on a cart, right? And I can start doing things like understanding exactly what I want in that cart, right? Am I clearing the cart? And from clearing the cart, do I want to get any information in that? Maybe this doesn't make sense. Maybe when you clear a cart, it shouldn't return anything. Sometimes teams will have scalar void, and that's returned when the cart's cleared. So now there just isn't anything being selected. You're just clearing the cart and you're showing them a blank cart on your screen, right? So what's really important here is we are grouping our functionality together so it makes sense to, you know, a random person coming in here. How can I start working within this graph, right? It has that context that I need right there. But you're also going to be iterating on it, right? You saw how like I just didn't even like that one thing of like, well, if I'm clearing the cart, there's no items it's going to return. I don't want to look at the cart. I'm not going to use those results. We didn't even talk whether it's a website, it's a mobile app, whatever it is. This is really now just thinking of like holistically, shopping cart. If you're clearing a shopping cart, what is the experience I actually want people to provide? Well, there is no data that you need back or returned here. If there is in the future, well, then that'll be something we change and we add. You know, inside of here, there could be something where like when you do clear a cart, maybe there's like a set of suggestions that come along that, right? So Maybe you have a cart suggestions type, and those cart suggestions is actually what's returned inside of there. And you can have that be an array of products. You can add more information. You can start changing and tweaking things as you see fits. And I think the really important thing to think about here is as you're designing a graph and starting to add these details and this granularity in there, you really want to think about it in a way of, I'm going to be making changes over time. It's going to be fluid, but you want to make these changes based off of the use cases, the feedback, things from those consumer teams. So like, we're trying to create an experience, but sometimes the experience we create, we design, we put together isn't actually how things get used in the real world. So we want to constantly be pruning our graph, right? If we have something on there that's not really being used, it's an opportunity for someone maybe to use it in a way that's not expected, not planned for, not the experience you want to deliver. And it's just dead weight on your graph. It's more confusion. You're just making more space inside there. Also, the reason why I say you shouldn't just copy a type from your REST API into your graph. You should really think about, like, what are the things that people need from this? Like, what should I be putting on there? So it's used in the right manner as how you want. And when someone doesn't have what they need, they're going to come and talk to you about it. You say, hey, I'm going to need you to add this field. And that's a very common thing. I've even had talks with internal employees at Apollo about, hey, it'd be great if we had this field to do these things, because this one that we have right there doesn't get me exactly what I need. It gets me almost all the way, but not there. It's a hint at missing functionality. Now, there's an important thing to note on mutations, and I'm going to see if I can pull this up real quick on the GraphQL spec. All right, there we go. Oh, yeah, there. Mutations. So one of the very important specific things about mutations inside of GraphQL is that they actually will be executed in series if you're sending multiple mutations. And what I mean by that with multiple mutations, oops, I meant just to show VS Code, is, let's say this mutation also, just for examples, have an extra thing there, is if you wanted to send two mutations. The way GraphQL work is this cart mutation is going to execute and complete, and then this example mutation is going to execute and complete. Now, I'm bringing this up because the pattern I just showed you, where all these items are nested under this type, means all of these, if you sent remove item, add item, remove item, for example here, remove item and clear are going to be executed in parallel. So the one caveat in GraphQL is root mutation fields are executed in series, top to bottom. Now, with this pattern of what I showed and what Apollo does, it does make an assumption. It makes an assumption that you're never going to send two mutations at the same time. One of the big things I see a lot of teams try and do is they want to have the mutation take whatever the output, whatever the response is, and then use that as an input. That's not supported in GraphQL currently right now. There is actually a proposal for a spec change specifically around that. It's been an ask in the community for a while, but not a thing today. What I always said, and what the reason why that hasn't just been put into the spec and everything is typically when you have this world where someone needs to send a mutation, get that response back, and then send another mutation to you, it's typically a hint that you have missing functionality in your graph, meaning there's two pieces that you should be bringing together. So I had mentioned authorize a card and charging a card. That's a great example where, sometimes you need to do those separately, but sometimes you want to do them together. And you don't want to have every client team making two requests for that when it could just be one. So a good example inside of that, but really important detail to note about mutations, because it is one of those little caveats inside of there. I see a lot of teams design both ways. It's going to be what is best for your scenario, and really contextualize that graph in a way of like what makes sense for our app, our business, the thing we're trying to create, the thing we're trying to do. All right. Now, there's a couple things inside of here. We had everything around this cart that we put together, but one of the things that I think is also really important is, when we're thinking about how users are interacting with your graph, just like with this mutation, I can understand I'm mutating a cart. It's very easy for me to read and everything. I like to create an entry point on my query for users. Specifically, I call it the me entry point. And the me entry point, I really like it. A lot of graphs use this. But the reason I really like it is because it directs a logged in authenticated user where you start, right? This is the authenticated entry point for anyone in our platform. And under that authenticated entry point should just give me what can I do inside of there. Now, I'm not saying that that portion of what I can do should change dynamically based on your bearer token. A lot of times this is where I mentioned contracts in the sense of we have a schema that will be stripped down into different pieces for hosting in different environments based on like what is needed for that. There's a lot of things I've seen. If you think about onion architecture kind of design, you typically have this graph server in it. Then you have some authentication layer around it, some routing layers. It's very common to, for example, based on an incoming authorization token, route to a specific instance or a specific deployment based on that. So like this is an internal employee, we're going to route it to the internal thing, for example. So we'll add in our user under the me entry point, right? And this is where all of those things of like, what can a user do? What can a user have? In our example, we had like a profile, and that has a user profile. A user profile could have things like name. Right? You might say, oh, well, what is the name? Okay, well, maybe it should be full name. Maybe we should have first name. Maybe we should have last name. This is kind of gets into like, what do you want to put it together? But what I think is important is you should be trying to take away as much work as you can from your client team. Like if you actually were saying, okay, first name, last name, does anyone ever display just the last name? I'm pretty hard pressed, but I don't think there's any app I've ever logged into that, says like, hello, Michael, or hello, Michael Watson, but it never says hello, Watson. It's always going to be the full name or that first name. And maybe you're not even doing anything like that. Maybe you're actually just like display, right? Or maybe it's a full display name. You can be as verbose as you want. What is the thing you actually want to write? And then maybe you don't even show the last name. You can't even query the last name because I don't even want you to provide an experience where you only display the last name to the user. There's also things that I always like to think about with like location. Let's say like user's profile had a geolocation on it. I don't know why you'd be doing latitude, longitude stuff like this, but let's say you had something like that. And so we have a location, we have a lat, we have a longitude. Now, if we think about the experience of what we're providing and how someone's going to be querying off of this user and everything, when I'm displaying information, how many apps am I actually displaying to you your latitude, longitude, location? Maybe there's a service that needs where that user's location is for whatever reason or anything like that, but is that actually part of the experience on the graph that we want to provide? Maybe a client developer is actually just using that latitude, longitude for the Google Maps API to direct them to a URL, and they're constructing that URL on their client side in some client side logic. Well, what if we just change this to like Google Maps URL? Really got rid of that location. Now I'm changing the experience where like, I'm not even giving you the latitude, longitude. I'm giving you just the Google Map URL because that's the experience I want to provide. And there's going to be a balance here. And this is the balance you're going to have to decide of how verbose, how much work you want to take off, because there's also the innovation side of things. Well, with a Google Maps URL, maybe this team found this clever thing to do. If I have the latitude longitude, I could do this new cool thing. Well, then they're now taking this Google URL, destructuring it to get that, they're parsing that string to get the latitude longitude out of the URL to use it. So maybe you want to, show both. And it's a zero cost to add that field in your server, right? You can add as many fields, as many types, as much stuff as you want here. Now, your schema is going to get bigger and bigger, right? And that's kind of that one side I said, you want to think about your graph as it's growing, as it's changing, because it might have sometimes where it gets too big and what happens in there. But you shouldn't let that sacrifice like what you have on your graph for like what teams actually need. Now, if nobody's using that latitude longitude, do you want to keep this on there forever? No, you should prune it off, right? You should upkeep your graph. This kind of gets into a little more of like, you should be monitoring your graph's usage to understand, how your graph and how your API is being used. When you think about an operation that's being sent to your graph, what's really cool here is this is your usage of your product. In the sense, when someone sends a query for my active cart, I can actually quantify how many times was the active cart queried for to give me a usage of like, is the cart a good featured thing in our platform? And it's actually a great way for you to measure when you add a new feature. You're going to add a new field into your graph that's going to have that functionality, that capability inside of there. And now you can directly measure how many times was that field used. And you can tie that into your KPIs and start measuring and understanding, okay, we made this investment into this specific functionality, this capability. What is the engagement, the interaction we have in there, right? And you can also start to understand when you have a workflow, when you think of, we'll go back to that Expedia example just real quick. When you think of you have a workflow like this, where you may be searching for a room. And when you get that, you have destinations that pop up and flights and these other things that pop up. You now kind of have this event of query to query to query. Well, what if, we just added in activities at Expedia? So activities is now part of this workflow a user goes through. Well, it would be really great to understand if users are still getting to that last query that's getting the car's information, or is all of a sudden things dying off earlier, right? You can start to now understand, like, we have 100 queries for the hotels. Then at activities, we have 90. And then at flights, we have 80. And at cars, we have 20. Like, what's that drop off happening? And how does that also measure against the mutations for actually checking out and buying those things? And it's really good to understand these KPIs are all intertwined together, and it's actually a really easy way to understand and measure what is that engagement, what is that experience usage in my graph. Now, I want to take just a quick moment to pause to see, are there any questions so far, any thoughts of like, interesting about, this decision inside of the schema? None of these decisions were made for a specific reason, probably more arbitrary, but are there any questions in the room, maybe around just your overall schema, things you might be thinking about inside of that? Cool. All right. So we have talked about a couple of things so far in designing our graph. We talked a little bit about some of the schema basics. We talked about like those documents, those different things. We talked about kind of building these types, a little bit about the mutations and everything. But you can even see just in our short exercise, we've kind of written just 40 lines, and we've made very basic things. And it's going to grow more and more and more over time. And you might want to have a world where you start breaking these apart. And this is where Apollo Federation is one of the technologies, open source specifications that Apollo created that's specifically around this. There are other tools out there for bringing together multiple GraphQL schemas, GraphQL tools with schema stitching. from the Guild is another one that's out there. I mentioned, having a monorepo and co-locating, for example, pieces of schema with resolvers and the aspects of that code. So those are all options out there as well. But what I want to emphasize is really that thought process more of like the entities in your graph and how those are not only tying together, but being distinct elements. So like, let's talk about the user specifically. Let's say our user has an email. Email is typically the most common way your account is like associated in platforms and stuff. So that email, maybe that's like the ID. That's our unique identifier for a user. And one of the things that I think about is like that user is my entity, right? And that entity has a lot of capabilities underneath it of like, what can a user do in our product or platform? And with Apollo Federation, we can actually start breaking these apart into various GraphQL microservices with what we call an @key directive for defining what an individual entity is. Now, I'm mentioning this just because I want to go over what I think is not the only, but one of the most important and only pieces of information you'd ever want to know about Apollo Federation when you're first starting out is this concept of just associating that entity with whatever its key field is. I mentioned directives. So @key is the Apollo Federation directive for defining what an entity is. And you can define the field that would be uniquely identifying that user. So now that user is essentially an entity inside of our graph. If you're kind of bringing this together in schema stitching, any other world, it's really going to be very similar in just a different pattern. But the important thing is you have this unique identifier for what that user is. That GraphQL relay spec we also talked about earlier, they do this with that node interface where the node interface is essentially everyone has to implement an ID. It's kind of the same concept, except it's forcing you to have everything as IDs and globally unique identifiers for your objects in your graph. Sometimes it's really easy to do from the start. Sometimes you have a lot of dispersed data sources already, and that becomes very difficult to have this uniquely identifying ID. Now, we're going to want to start breaking out into our various different pieces of our graph. And our user is one aspect we want to pull out. Our cart is one aspect we want to pull out. We want to have those separate from each other. And so what we need to start thinking about is, we started out with the cart. Well, what if when we started adding in the user and those other things, those just became their own pieces of the schema? So I'm going to add another subgraph for our users. And I'm just going to take our user and put it over there. Ooh, look at that. That's fun. It wouldn't be a good demo if something didn't happen live, right? Haha. That's okay though. Let's see. It did save, but that's something else. That's okay though. So we moved our user over here. This me doesn't make sense over here because there's no longer that user. We'll take that me out. Okay, so we have that. Now we're getting an error saying there's no user profile. That's right, that's over here. Now what we've done is we've started to break this out into one piece. Let's see, what's it yelling at me right now? Well, that's a full on break right there. Let me just try to reload this window and see if that refreshes everything real quick. It didn't. I'm probably missing something very basic on my screen. I'm just like missing over it. but I can't see it. Maybe it's just a bug in my thing on my end. But the point is more of, we're taking out that specific functionality that's associated with that user and we're putting it into its own little GraphQL schema, right? And this is where we're starting to decide what are the capabilities that are going to go with that entity and how that's going to be kind of brought over into this other world. I'm definitely going to take a look at this. I'll make sure that as part of that repo that I initially linked, I'll add some information about the README specifically for this one error and what happened here after the conference. So I take some time to look into that, see the specific detail of what's going on here. I'm pretty sure it's a bug in my thing. Okay, so we've really just displayed of like how we're trying to now start taking individual pieces of our schema, putting into various aspects. Now, you can break this apart as much as you want. And one of the questions I get a lot of times is like, should I start with breaking out GraphQL microservices? Is that where I should start as my first step? Definitely not. When you start thinking about GraphQL microservices, you're going to need to have two microservices to really start putting things together. But while you're doing GraphQL, you're going to have to learn how to host a GraphQL server in your production environment. You're going to have to learn all the CI/CD pipeline stuff that you're going to have to do. And all of those learnings will directly apply to hosting that second GraphQL microservice. So you always have to start out with one GraphQL server. And it's more important to note that as your GraphQL server grows over time, that if it ever has a day where it is too big and you want to start breaking it apart, there are strategies, there's options around that. And I think the thing you want to focus on is specifically what are those entities and the capabilities that are going to come along with it. And I'm going to put those into its own individual service within that graph. All right. Now, I'm going to move over into we'll start talking a little bit about creating our first GraphQL server, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the schema stuff we had, and we're just going to look at a single server, not a distributed graph. But I want to pause and see, are there any questions about where I might want to start with my graph, or how I kind of started putting these types and mutation stuff together? Cool. All right, so I'm going to switch over outside of Workbench now that we don't need that anymore. And inside of here, that repo, I also have this monolith folder. And I put this in here just so we'd have some code and some examples, things to look at. We're going to be using Apollo Server for this example. Apollo Server is an open source GraphQL library. It's fully spec compliant. I should show it on the screen. All right, so Apollo Server, fully open source library. It's gone through a lot of iterations. We have a team that works on this. This is, I think, a good example of something to get started, but there's, like I said, a lot of options, all those other languages. If you wanted to even just see, the Java GraphQL, there's a lot of different options inside of there, but there's a GraphQL Java. And then you can even go down here and I think, yeah, there's the Spring Boot example. So if you want to get started with Spring Boot and GraphQL Java, you can get right into that. All those things I showed with like even those language implementations, Apollo Federation supports over 16 different languages as well. So you really don't have to worry about these things popping up in the future. They're all options and things available for you. Really just want to kind of get your feet wet and start developing that first piece. So I mentioned we're going to start with Apollo Server. So I have a simple little node application. I just said initialized it. I have a couple different things inside of here. Specifically, I have GraphQL as one of my packages. I have my Apollo server. I have some other Apollo packages in here. Those are things we'll kind of talk about. One was the Federation one, and I want to show something quick about that at the end. But at its base level, GraphQL and Apollo server are the big things inside of here. This is the code I have for my GraphQL server. We have Apollo server being imported from our Apollo server package. And before we kind of get into anything about the server, let's just focus on this block of code right here real quick. There's a couple things inside of GraphQL. So every one of those types, those fields, those things you create, when you're writing the code for the implementation on the server side, there's this concept of resolvers. You have resolvers that are going to map up to the types, the fields, anything in there, and that's what's going to resolve to that information. So every time you build a type, anything like that in your schema, you're going to have a resolver that's going to be associated with that. Now, by default, the resolver will just return whatever it is. So like if you don't define a resolver, you're going to get a default resolver within inside of Apollo server. But I think the more important thing of what goes on here is mocking. And when you start thinking about building out that first GraphQL server, we kind of went like, all right, built out our schema. That schema is right here, right? So we have this schema that has all this information inside of here. This is the GitHub schema. So now that we have that schema, maybe we don't have all the resolvers yet. Maybe we don't have our data sources connected up yet, but we still want to play around with things. There's this concept of mocking resolvers. This isn't an Apollo thing. This is just a GraphQL thing. Mocking in GraphQL is very common. There's a direct pattern for that. So we can provide mocks, which is the same shape as our resolvers, into our graph. And then we're going to need to bring that together with those types, that schema that we put together. So we're just reading in that schema as a single file. And there's this common thing, I put this in here, GQL. You're going to hear GQL tag if you start getting into GraphQL. This is essentially a simple way and basically the same thing as what the parse is doing for you. It's taking in whatever that string is. There's also the option of like substituting, changing like a thing for a thing. But this is returning that document node. So it's returning that GraphQL document. Now, we have our server, which there's inside of Apollo server, there's a couple different constructor options inside of here. And one of the things you can do is there is a type defs that is expected. This is just the document node or that string you want to put in. We just wrap that GQL right there as well. So it's kind of extracted away and you don't have to worry about it. And you could pass your resolvers to it directly. Apollo server takes care of that for you. It can start it up. Now, the reason I mentioned about that whole like GraphQL microservices, federation, the reason I don't think you have to worry about that type of stuff right away or anything, is because look how simple that is. I mean, to take your server and all of a sudden plug it into a federated world or something like that is really just taking those individual type defs and resolvers. And instead of constructing your server like that, you're just passing the schema directly. So Apollo server can also take a schema, which is a GraphQL schema. A GraphQL schema is something that we can build from our federation package, and there's nothing you have to change. So even that whole like I defined at keys, you don't even have to do any of that. You just have to build the graph schema using the federation package. So don't think about, do I need to think about or do I need to start this now? Do I need to like do Apollo federation or anything? You just need to start learning GraphQL. You need to get your first graph hosted. There's a day where it might break down, and that migration path is very easy. Just one line of code, install a package. Now, for what we're doing today and everything, it actually doesn't matter which one we use. We could go either way. I put them both in there just because I wanted to show you that flexibility, that option. Now, the mocks and the resolvers inside here don't really have any information or any data in here. We're actually just mocking everything right off the bat inside of here. There's a lot of things available in Apollo server. Mock entire schema is going to be defaulted to true. If you wanted to mock portions of the schema, but also have resolvers serving the rest of the schema, you can do that, setting mock entire schema to false. So it's kind of a way for you to do that in a couple of things. Now, depending on how comfortable you are, if you like the terminal, you can come in and change the right folder. You can start that up here. Server has already been declared. Did I not save this file? Oh no, I just like did it uncommented the wrong one. Second screen's blocking the small portion at the end. So graphs running locally, everything. Wrong window. There. So this is that sandbox that popped up in the beginning. And it's not going to show you that same link because it was our graph and we had some changes. But if you're running anything locally using Apollo server, we have this as defaulted. So you can actually click query your server. And it takes you into this sandbox. Now, this isn't an Apollo server thing. By default, we use this. If you wanted to use sandbox, you can use it for any GraphQL server. It's not an Apollo server specific thing. It's going to introspect that local host, whatever URL you put here. So if I even want to change this to like GitHub's, it would introspect their endpoint. And you can see here's all the information that's being popped up from that schema we had defined in here. And if we wanted, we could, come in here. We don't have the right query. Let's see, what might be a good query? Licenses, body. And we run that, you see, it just returns mock data, hello worlds, right? So that's kind of like out of the box. Apollo server provides a mocking engine that allows you kind of just take whatever scheme you design, start building it. And then we can start writing resolvers for that. There's a lot about resolvers, but at its basic level, it's really just going to match the shape of that scheme you defined. So we were just querying, what was that, licenses. There's going to be a root that's returned with arguments and context. And the root, let's say I have a type that's going to be, for example, what was that license type actually? Oh, okay. So it is just license. So we might have a license type, and that license type has individual fields that we could be returning. Let's put that comma here. That license could also have its own resolver if you wanted. And what's nice about this is that root is going to have something available depending on wherever it's being queried from, right? So if we think about like the chain of resolvers and that query we're running, the licenses is going to be the first resolver that's hit because that is the top level one. Kind of pull this over. Come on. All right. So that's the top level. And then because it's returning license types, the next resolver that's going to be executed is going to be this license resolver. And it's going to be returning each one of those individual licenses. So you may need to, change the shape of an individual object. You may need to use certain fields from that object to calculate other fields. There's lots of different stuff. But you're going to be able to make these resolvers and chain them together in the way you need. There's a lot of great information around this online. We're not going to be able to go into like writing all these resolvers out. That's going to take some time, but it's important to note that these resolvers are essentially connecting to those fields and those types that you're defining inside of your schema. And that's what's going to be resolving that. So any arguments you have that's going to be in here, the context of that incoming request. I mentioned passing that authentication header to downstream services. So lots of ways you can do that. This is the context of an individual request. Apollo server also gives you an option of having a context function. So you can actually take that incoming context, that header token. Let's say you have like multiple authentication tokens and you want to like put them in. This is this token, this token. You can actually construct and form that context right there. So really important to note that like that's all going to trickle through, and you're going to use that information from, this is what's coming in from that context, that request. This is how we're going to create that context and use it in our resolvers. Now, one last thing I want to note in here, because I think it's super important. I'm a .NET developer at heart, and I think it's super important to have debugging capabilities in like anything you're building, whether it's a graph, whether it's a whatever. So one of the things I added was VS Code's launch configuration. It's super simple to do with VS Code. But what's really nice is you can actually launch your code and you can debug into these resolvers and items, right? So you can actually set individual breakpoints, debug, and see the chain of those resolvers. So it was really easy for me to say, hey, the license is going to be the first thing to hit, and then it's going to be this. But sometimes that's hard to understand, especially when you're first getting started. And I find it really helpful to be able to set breakpoints with inside of your resolvers and be able to go between them. So check that out. I try and always say debug first, like set up debugging from day 0, and then you have it always. You could still use NodeMon. You could still use a bunch of other things out there, but that debugging capability has saved me so much time in so many places. It's just one of my big tips and tricks. Just add it in. I've got working for Java servers, for Ruby servers, for like everything, all in VS Code. It's pretty nice. All right. Now I want to be cognizant of time because we are coming close to the end of our show here. And I think there's one last piece that I kind of wanted to talk about, which is when we're thinking about getting started with our first GraphQL server. I mentioned here's what Apollo server is. Here's how you can get started with that. But at its core functionality, you need to think about what is that schema you want to expose? How are you going to expose that schema in the right capabilities entities? And then how are you going to connect that to the data sources, which are these resolvers of what you need? And once you start doing that, it becomes an iterative process. All right, we're going to add these new fields, these new types. Those are connected to these data sources. We create these resolvers. And it becomes a repeating pattern. There's, of course, different challenges, different things that will pop up. But all of those are there. And adding in things like caching and changing that stuff becomes iterative and added on there. There's a lot of stuff out there for caching. Data loader from Facebook in the early GraphQL days is very commonly used for N+1 issues inside of your graph. Lots of stuff around there and really great content, not just from Apollo, from the whole community. I mean, it's amazing to see the solutions out there. So I'm showing everything Apollo server, but I strongly recommend you check out everything in the community because there's some really, really unique, interesting solutions out there. And it's one of the reasons I love GraphQL is because there's just so much you can do with it. Now, I also want to leave you with some getting started materials. Now, this is going to be a little bit more specifically into the Apollo world. I think one of the biggest things to get started is Apollo Odyssey. This is actually something we just launched pretty recently. We have certifications now. What's really great is you can go through this liftoff course, and it gives you a lot of those basics. So if you wanted to get more than what we got into here, each one of these courses is not only a class that's just like individual things, but you'll actually build something in here. It's a really fun course too. You get to click around, a lot of interaction in building out this space Airbnb program. And so this kind of also covers the client side of things, which we didn't get a chance to cover today. I mean, there's so much more than just the server side of things and connecting data. There's the consuming side as well. And this is going to get into a lot of the aspects that we didn't get to cover in today's session. I had mentioned Workbench. I put a link inside of here. The Getting Started with Apollo Studio. If you do want to use Apollo Server as your first GraphQL server, here's a great workflow of exactly what I was talking about. Defining the data you need, the schema, the resolvers, everything inside as a step-by-step getting started. So you have Odyssey, you have Getting Started with Apollo Server, and you have Workbench to help you design and try and plan that and figure that out. Now, it looks like we're actually just at time. I want to thank everyone for sticking with me today. I know we went through the whole 2 hours, kept most of the people through the whole time, so I really appreciate it. If you have any questions at all, I got my Twitter, my GitHub there. Feel free to DM me on Twitter, message me. I definitely respond to people all the time. If you want to meet with me, I wrote down everyone's names that's here. Message me. I want to meet with you too. More than happy to talk more if you have more questions or anything like that. Well, with that, that concludes this session. Thank you everyone for taking the time to be with me today. I really appreciate it. And I hope you get to play around with GraphQL more and you find a lot of success with it. Cheers.